Welcome back to The Move. We're vibing through the book 10 minutes at a time. I'm your host, Justin Koo, and in today's episode, we're talking about that one time in the Bible that Joseph rejects the sexual advances of the most powerful and wealthy woman in Egypt. If you're wondering what we're looking at, Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 through 23. My guest for today is not a pastor on today's episode, Kessia Rain. Good to see you.
Hey, Justin, very good to be here. Yeah, not Pastor Kessia Rain.
You told me, stop, you don't have to introduce me as Pastor Kessia Rain, but I feel like that's just one of the many features of having you guys, my friends, you guys are friends, on the show, that you bring this wealth of information and knowledge to the episode. And so today you're not a pastor, you're just a friend, but I'm so glad that you're here.
Well, I look forward to future episodes in which you will call me Mother Kessia Rain Bennett, or
there you go.
Former DHHS employee, Kessia Rain Bennett. Kessia Rain Bennett, MDiv, PhD candidate.
Ooh, there you go.
No.
PhD candidate. That's a fun one. I know that's a lot of work, and you've been doing some things in the background there that are closing the gap on that. So I'm very excited for you. Before we launch into kind of just, I guess, the narrative of the text, I guess one of the questions I want to start with is, I'm curious if this specific story means as much to ladies as it does to men. And the context for that is, as a young man who dealt with an addiction to the LUST thing for many, many, many years, I would always look at this story as like the hopeful, like maybe conclusion of my life story. Like, man, if only one of these days I could be like Joseph and I could be faithful like him. And this was always one of those stories that just felt slightly out of reach, but also like kind of was still like the hope at the end of the tunnel, something that I was looking forward to. And I don't know, I think that a lot of men maybe look at the story from that perspective. It's like, man, Joseph was a man of good character. This is someone that I could hopefully become one of these days. I don't know if that's a theme that stands out as strongly to maybe the average lady or not. I don't know. I'm curious. How has this story felt for you growing up or just throughout the years for you?
Well, I certainly can't speak for all ladies, although I don't think I've looked at Joseph in that same way that you're describing. When I hear the story of Joseph, I think I admire him in this moment. And I know there are lots of women also caught up in that same kind of cycle that you were referencing before. And I do think probably what usually happens, though, is when you hear a story of someone that did great, that succeeded, where you're like, they succeeded and I have failed 100,000 times. Somehow after a while, it stops inspiring confidence and starts inspiring despair. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Because there's something about him or her that's characteristically different, and I don't measure up. I have been there before too, reading this story. I have absolutely felt that way before too.
Yeah, I like the more positive take of like, I could be like Joseph one day, but sometimes it's also like, well, I'm clearly not Joseph, so I guess I will wallow in my pit of despair.
Oh no! Unfortunately, start feeling much more like Abraham with the Abimelech story, or Egypt, or the wait, was it Potiphar? Who did they interact with earlier in Egypt when they're selling off their wife into to the highest bidder, so to speak?
Pharaoh.
Oh, it was Pharaoh himself. Oh my goodness. Okay, so this is one of the themes that's emerging from the story, right? Is that Joseph is getting it right where others have gotten it wrong before.
True. Yeah. So the narrative here is, Joseph's just been sold into slavery. So then someone buys him, and that man is Potiphar, and he works in, Pharaoh's government administration. So he's one of Pharaoh's officials. So he's definitely got, the bigger house somewhere near a good view of the Nile or whatever. And so he's got many servants and lots of things going on. And Joseph does so well as a servant. He just kind of he gets promoted and promoted and promoted. He ends up at the top. Things are going so great. And then Joseph was well built, the Bible says.
He was doing all right. He maybe did some CrossFit.
Yeah. Some or whatever the exercise of choice. So he's well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife takes notice of Joseph and is like, "Hey, come to bed with me." So he refuses and refuses and refuses, and then they get alone, and she basically makes a false accusation that lands him in prison. And our time here today goes all the way to the end of the chapter, verse 23, where while Joseph is in the prison, God is with him there, and he moves up the ranks and basically becomes number 2 in the prison. So there's this whole arc of sold into slavery, then up to the number 2 in Potiphar's house, then way down back into prison, and then ascends the ranks to become a man of responsibility in the prison.
Yeah. One of the things that the text is very, very insistent on us recognizing is the fact that the Lord is with Joseph. And it's actually uttered not just at the top of the mountain, but also on the bottom on either side. And I think it's just so interesting because when I used to think about, was God with me? I would look at moments where I'm, master of Potiphar's house as those moments where, yes, God is with me, God's blessing me, everything I touch turns to gold. And then in the moments where I'm in prison or in the moments where I'm being sold into slavery, it's so much easier to believe that God isn't with you. And I think like when I think about the whole prosperity gospel kind of narrative that exists in the United States and maybe other places, it's this idea that God is with you when things are going good. And that's the way that you can measure his presence is when you're wealthy, when business is going great, your relationships are flourishing, maybe you start to look a little bit more like Joseph and you're well built kind of a thing. God is with you. But the narrative is actually highlighting, yes, that he was with him then, but he's also with him in all the other seasons of life. And it starts to get me to think, it's like, how many times in my life have I thought that maybe God wasn't with me, but all along God was, and more to the point of the text, that everything that I was doing was prospering. Because that's one of the things that emerges in the text as well, that Joseph is prospering, yet he's in prison.
I say that. That is so good. That was totally my takeaway too from this passage. Because and that means that the text was doing its job. We were, as we read it, it's like, yeah, the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. The Lord was with Joseph in the prison and he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And I'm so glad you brought that up. We need to put to rest once and for all that our circumstances tell us accurately whether God is on our side or on some enemy's side. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
The Bible is clear that God is for us, right? And even it goes even farther than that in Romans chapter 8 to say that if God is for us, who can really be against us? Who can really bring a charge against God's chosen ones? Now,
Oh, wow.
when we're in this life, will people say false things about us? Will they slander us? Will they pick apart everything we do? Will they, speak wrongly about us or undermine us or work against our good? Yes. But ultimately, God is not only with us, he is for us. And so no one gets to bring a charge against those whom God has chosen because it's God who justifies us.
Wow. That is so encouraging because there have been things that have been happening over the last couple of weeks in the background of my life where I'm kind of going through something like this as far as charges being brought against me, and it's like I don't know always what's the right thing to do. We see the example of people standing up for themselves. You see the example of just kind of being silent, and I don't know. I'll be honest. It has led to a certain degree of unsettledness in my spirit, so to speak. And when I experience that, I'm doing my best to be thoughtful and returning back to Scripture and just reassuring myself of the promises of God. But there's an element in which you can't help but notice that things are happening. And I'm sure that, Joseph in prison notices, I'm not in the palace anymore. Like there's bars here, like I'm maybe not fed nearly as well. And I'm sure he noticed these things. And yet we see this example of just kind of returning to the reality that circumstances don't always reveal truth.
Absolutely. And Joseph, when he's in his father's house, is faithful. And he will even call his brothers out on their lack of integrity. Well, that does not end well for him. He gets sold into slavery after hanging out in a pit for a while. Then he gets to Potiphar's house and he has character and he has integrity and he's committed to doing his best. And we see how God's presence and his character brings about a blessing to Potiphar, right? And yet, nevertheless, he ends up with this false accusation. Now he's in prison. Do you think that Joseph may have possibly ever been tempted to think, what is the point of doing the right thing?
I don't know if Joseph did, but I know that if I was in that position, there's a strong likelihood I would have asked myself that question.
I imagine he must have been tempted, even if he never gave into that temptation, to basically be like, who cares about doing the right thing? Because when I try, it's not like it gets me a better outcome. So yeah, okay, now
Wow.
I'm number 2. I've really ascended the ranks in prison. I mean,
Yeah. I'm number 2 in
in
prison. Like,
prison.
that's
Oh,
great.
thanks. And yet that character, that willingness to be the same Joseph, the same person committed to
Hmm.
God and integrity, standing in the integrity and in the righteousness God has given him, standing in or maybe not standing in, maybe sometimes clinging to, grasping by desperate faith that God was still with him. That Joseph then is the one who can be promoted, as we'll see in chapters to come, to
Hmm.
be not just out of prison, but to be in a position of immense influence and even affluence. And so that character, let's be the kind of people like Joseph, where our character can be the same, whether we're in Potiphar's house or we're in prison, that we will stand in integrity and we'll let God prosper us and bless us.
Is this one of the conclusions that we should come to from the text? Because over the last, I don't know, 30 odd chapters, the thing that's been highlighted time and time again is the faithfulness of God despite humanity's weaknesses and failures and foibles and all the different things, the strategeries, as Jonathan likes to use that word. And it's just been almost to the exact opposite point. Don't do the things that these people are doing, but look at God. Even in the middle of it all, he's being faithful. And the promise has been the covenant, the covenantal promise. I will be with you. I'm going to cause you to, you'll be a blessing in all these different ways. Like there's just this constant returning back to who God is at kind of to just pushing humanity to the side, so to speak. But in this chapter, I really do feel like the tone shifts. It's like, yes, God's there, God's there, God's there, but it also seems to be highlighting, look at Joseph, and this does feel like one of those moments where the Bible is maybe almost like nudging us, like, pay attention to this. This is what it's looking like when it's done, quote unquote, right. And I'm hesitant to make that conclusion because of what all the other chapters have told us up to this point. But is this one of the conclusions that we can come to?
I think it is that Joseph is a moral example for us, an exemplar,
Hmm.
someone that we can say, wow, this is what it looks like to really walk in integrity. And we do actually see that with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a lot spottier.
It's hit or
You
miss.
go, I don't know if that was the right choice. But one of the things that brings to my mind is we can absolutely draw the conclusion from previous chapters that God works in spite of human foibles and failures.
Yeah.
100% God will remain faithful. And yet, we don't want to take that path. How much better
No.
for God to be faithful with people who are standing in
Hmm.
uprightness and integrity and who are
Yeah.
choosing the path of rightness and goodness. So I'd say, yeah, let's go ahead and take the example of contrast from some of the other people in the book, and let's go ahead and grasp what God is showing us here in the life of Joseph.
I love that because one of the common objections that I've heard, and Paul seems to assume that this is going to be one of the common objections on the fact that God is so good, his spirit is poured out into you, like you're free from this, and this. It's like, what? Should we continue sinning? Should we continue making mistakes so that God's grace may abound? And he's like, no, of course not. Like, that's just foolish. Why would you ever want to do that? Just because God is faithful when Abraham's maybe less faithful doesn't mean that we should strive to be like Abraham in the unfaithfulness. And I just think that that's just such a beautiful point that you're pulling out here. And one of the little tidbits that I found in kind of mulling over this text and then doing a little bit of research is that there's only one person, according to the book that I was reading actually, that there's only one person in the book of Genesis who is actually described as having the Spirit of God. And it's actually Joseph. And I thought that's
Ooh.
brilliant. Like, here we are actually being served up a moral character, someone that we can actually follow after, someone who seemingly is getting things right even when circumstances are not in his favor. Genesis 41, verse 38 describes Joseph as a man who has the Spirit of God. And I just thought that brilliant. This to me is a way to kind of help to reconcile some of the challenges that we've seen, but also it really highlights just maybe why, or just maybe not why, but it certainly highlights the potency of Joseph's story in this chapter.
I like that a lot. I did not know that. Did you say the only person in the book of Genesis described that way?
That's what
Cool.
that's what this book here, I bought this book after Jonathan recommended it, the Pentateuch as narrative. He calls it the cheat sheet. And I'm like, I get why it's called a cheat sheet because yeah, there's some beautiful things that are here. But yeah, it according to this book, that's the only person described as having the Spirit of God in Genesis.
I like that. I our quality of life can be one thing or another, right? Like we
Mm-hmm.
can rely on the faithfulness of God even when we got to prison on accurate charges. Okay?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah,
no,
yeah.
we're here because we earned this. God is still faithful 100%.
Mm,
When we
praise the Lord.
find ourselves in prison because of unjust charges, God is still faithful. And then the choice set
Mm,
before us of, are we going to walk in the Spirit? Are we
mm,
going to set our minds on the things of the Spirit? Are we going to pursue and seek the holiness in our real lived out choices day by day or not?
mm.
That is no small insignificant choice. It doesn't
Absolutely.
mean it's going to guarantee us an outcome, but would you rather be the kind of person that even in prison has the Spirit of God? I would.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, is it this what is it David or I think it's in the Psalms where he's like, I'd rather be like at the holding the door in the kingdom of God than like in a palace somewhere else, kind of an idea?
Yeah, is that Psalm 84 or something? But it's better to be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. Something
Wow.
like that.
Yeah. 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 I think that that's absolutely it. It just, I guess I'm seeing even the echoes of when Paul's in prison writing, listen, like I know how to abound in all things. I know how to be happy with a lot. I know how to be happy with a little bit. I think this is the context of that often misquoted verse, right? I can do all things through Christ. Doesn't mean that I can deadlift 1,000 pounds through Jesus who gives me the strength to deadlift 1,000 pounds. So he's like, listen, I know how to exist in all stages of life when there's a lot, when things are going great, when things are being maybe not so great on the surface, when people are slandering me and attacking me. He's like, I'm good because I know whose I am.
Let's live life like that. Man, this is the abundant life Jesus talked about. He told that to
Mm.
peasants. Jesus said,
Yeah.
I've
And he
come.
was himself in many ways a homeless peasant.
That's right. Like Jesus did not have earthly wealth. He didn't have the
Hmm.
kind of prosperity we see even in some of these patriarchs.
Mm.
But what he promised us was abundant life, not necessarily
Yeah.
abundant material possessions, not necessarily abundant fame, but
Mm.
abundant life. Man, that is where
Yeah.
it's at. We can have a vital living connection with God right now, today, and every day. And
Mm.
that's worth more. That's worth more than anything.
If there's such thing as a prosperity gospel, then it sounds like this is the prosperity gospel, is that you prosper no matter the circumstance, because prosperity doesn't actually depend on the circumstances. It's actually dependency on the promise of God.
That's too good. We got to end it right there. That's perfect. Tie
And
that with a
drop
bow.
the mic. Hey guys, no plug, no commercial other than just to say thank you for those of you guys who are sponsoring us on Patreon. You guys have been making a huge difference in moving this series forward. We're really, really grateful for that. If you haven't been supporting on Patreon, we also want to say thank you because there's a lot of you guys following along and sharing the episodes and rating the podcast on Apple Podcasts and leaving comments and whatever your role in this, whether you are like the non-pastor Kessia Rain Bennett on the show or you are doing anything else in between. We're just grateful to be able to share this journey with you guys. It's been an honor. It's been a privilege, and I'm so excited that we get to continue doing this together.